So you may have heard of the military-industrial complex, a term which was coined during Eisenhower's farewell address, but today in this video we will be examining the pretext for how that term came to be, what he was actually referring to. But first, we gotta talk about Battlefield 6, along with EA being acquired by the Saudis. So today we're taking a break from reviewing protest music, revolutionary music. If you are in the market for new music and you need something to help get you through the day in these dark times we are living in, definitely check out some of those other videos. So today we are looking at video games, war, history, the arms industry, and so much more. So definitely like and subscribe if you like the vibe. Check out the Patreon for exclusive videos if you want to support the channel further. And, well, let's get started. So it appears that Battlefield 6 actually had a successful launch, which is good. It took them long enough. I mean, how hard is it for a AAA studio making millions of dollars to actually make a game that on launch day actually works, is accessible for everyone, the people that paid good money for that product? And of course I could go on and on about the games industry and just the state of everything now. But still, kudos to them for taking a year off, really re-examining the formula and actually making a good product that again actually works on launch day, and the game's actually pretty fun, so there is that. So super quick backstory on me, I'm pretty much a lifelong gamer, with my first introduction to online multiplayer shooters being the OG Call of Duty 4, of course, masterful game, loved it to pieces. And of course I fell in love with all the sequels, Modern Warfare 2, and then Black Ops, World at War with the zombies. Call of Duty was pretty much just the staple for me in terms of really just video games in general. Until one day I was actually gifted a different game from a friend who didn't like this one all too much, so he gave it to me, Battlefield Bad Company 2. And let me tell you guys, this game changed my life. Was never the same. And while I still enjoy the twitchy reaction-based gameplay of COD even to this day, I still have a preference for the large-scale destructible environments with the tanks and the helicopters and the jets and the, oh, you know what I'm talking about, that really only Battlefield can provide. And really, in my book, I guess, you know, I want to say that Bad Company 2 is the superior product out of all of them, but to be honest, I think Battlefield 4 kind of gives it a run for its money, especially considering the DLC that it provided. It was very much on point. So really, these two are kind of tied in my book, I guess. But Bad Company 2, those were the days. Like, if I had to give a highlight about my life from high school before I became politically aware, it would have to be probably something like this. However, there was another entry in the series that's another fan favorite. I also personally really enjoyed it, and that one was called Battlefield 1. The difference between this and really a lot of other first-person shooters and really just games in general is that Battlefield 1 had the interesting setting of being in World War I, which was admittedly at the time a good change of pace for the Battlefield series. Sort of experimental in its own right, trying something new. It was a dark, gritty, gruesome, and overall brutal, yet fun, depiction of what that war looked like. However, my excitement for the game was eventually soured, not because of the game itself, because the game itself was actually very good, but my experience was hindered because of a book that I was reading at the time. So by the time Battlefield 1 was actually released, I was already fluttering through the pages of Noam Chomsky, Chris Hedges, Naomi Klein, and Chalmers Johnson, so at that point I was already pretty well versed in how governments and the press will use their influence to sway public opinion, drum up those war drums, spew the propaganda to maybe change that public opinion to support a war in a foreign land, sending the troops, the underpaid troops, to those foreign lands in the interest of the government, the corporations, to say nothing of the vast fortunes of wealth that is spent on maintaining and upgrading our defense industry. But again, Battlefield 1 did not take place on the modern battlefield. It took place in World War I. And so, soon after its release, I started reading another book. This one right here. War Is A Racket by two-time Medal of Honor recipient and Marine Corps General Smedley Butler. Trying not to flashbang you with this glare. Looks kinda cool though. I am so easily entertained. Now, there's a lot to say about General Smedley Butler, but I highly recommend the Behind the Bastards podcast, who did an excellent overview, not just of him, but also what is known as the business plot, which was a literal fascist attempt at an overthrow of the American government in the 1930s. And one of the people involved in the business plot was actually Prescott Bush of the Bush family. Yes, that Bush family. I'm sure you've heard of George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, Jeb. So there was a literal fascist conspiracy to overthrow the government in 1933 with the help of Bush, Prescott Bush, the Prescott Bush. So Prescott Bush and William Randolph Hearst and a bunch of other people wanted Smedley Butler to be installed as a dictator because he was popular among the World War I veterans who kept protesting outside of the White House. But we're going to kind of skip over that segment of history. Definitely check out the Behind the Bastards podcast for more information on that topic. It's good, it's educational, you'll probably laugh. But Marine Corps General Smedley Butler didn't just save democracy by foiling the business plot. He also wrote a book about his lived experience being that Marine Corps general and the things that he saw during that time. Also, just a heads up, this book is very short. You could definitely read it in an afternoon. I actually just listened to the audiobook to freshen up on the contents, and that in of itself is only maybe an hour long. So really, overall, it's not that much of a time sink for the perspective that you would gain from that time period. But I digress. Anyways, super quick recap from my notes of the things that I thought were interesting from this book. Again, this is no substitute for the book itself, but some of the things that I wanted to mention, I guess. He has an interesting line about how war is the only racket where profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives, and how the First World War minted 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires, again just giving the sheer size of the wealth that war created, while of course the ones on the front lines are not making anything at all really. He also talks about Hitler and the rearmament of Germany after World War I, which of course is always rather interesting. He also mentions a possible incoming war with Japan. Imagine that. He also has a segment breaking down the profits company by company in terms of pre-war profits and post-war profits, again just showing the disparity of that wealth generated, including one example about one shoe company that was selling enough shoes to the government for 8 pairs to be assigned per soldier, but those soldiers only ever got 1 pair of shoes. Also, that same company would also sell those shoes to the enemy because, of course, everybody needs shoes, and if you are selling shoes in a war, I mean, hey, more money for you. Another similar example would be the 20 million mosquito nets that were purchased, again, by the government, yet none of those mosquito nets actually found their way to Europe. And of course, he goes into the human cost of war, how he visited some of these government hospitals, and he found both the physically disabled along with the mentally destroyed. And it's also crazy to me that apparently soldiers could actually barter for their labor just like a factory worker could, where they would actually be awarded prize money for overturning enemy vessels or taking fortifications. But eventually the government got privy to how much money this was actually costing, and they realized they could save a lot of money if they just started conscripting people, drafting people into the war, at which point they wouldn't have to pay that bonus. They wouldn't have to pay that prize money for good work on the battlefield, just shoveling the young into the fire. Then, of course, if you survived the war, you were not paid a bonus, but you were given medals because, of course, medals were cheaper than actual payment. And I'm not trying to discredit the medals that people have earned because, of course, that does mean something, but it essentially preys on the human psychology of prestige, of actually earning an achievement. So, like, sure, we can keep the medals, but at the same time, how about we just increase the pay or increase the bonuses or just increase not going to war in the first place? He also talks about the effective use of propaganda, how people were made to feel ashamed if they did not join the military. And he talks about how even God got involved with the clergy, saying that this was God's war, and yet the Germans did the same, sending their men to the fire to appease the same God. Crazy. Then, near the end of the book, he actually has a segment on how to break this racket, starting off with taking the profits out of the equation, implementing a change where every company, every institution, every banker, every manager, every factory worker, every politician, and every general doesn't make a cent more than the guy in the trench, which is nice, but probably not feasible, really. Right? Tell me I'm wrong in the comments. Would love to be wrong. Or making it that only those who volunteer to fight, those who volunteer to join the military, to go to war, are the ones who vote on if they go to war or not in the first place. And of course, the third option is just using the military for defense only. You know, the Department of Defense, not to be confused with the Department of War. Of course, there is some weird doublespeak in there anyways, but yeah. Now, while this book is great, it's emotional, it's actually very sarcastic, and it's a good picture of Smedley Butler's lived experience, the things that he saw, the things that he went through, and not even just in the First World War, but also in multiple other wars and conflicts. However, there is another book that I read immediately after this one, written just 1 year later in 1934. This one is much more analytical, it's not emotional in the slightest, and it gives a historical account of weapons manufacturing, the arms dealers themselves, as well as their influence with governments and public opinion, and it's this book right here, Merchants of Death, written by these guys. Not even going to attempt that because we all know I can't pronounce shit. Now, in a very bizarre twist of events, my grandfather actually owned this book, so it was just kind of hanging out on the bookshelves. One day I thought it was interesting to just pick it up and kind of flip through, and I realized what it was, so of course, naturally, after reading War Is A Racket, I decided to read this as well. Now, this book is a historical account, again, of the arms industry, so it covers even small arm manufacturers like Colt, Winchester, Remington, as well as the heavy hitters like the DuPonts, JP Morgan, as well as one guy in particular that I think everyone ought to be aware of. His name is Basil Zaharoff, and he was the chief merchant of death. And again, Behind the Bastards did an excellent series on Basil Zaharoff. I really can't recommend that podcast enough, obviously, since I just plugged them twice in one video. But this one is a bit less funny, but it does get into the heart of who this man is, what he accomplished during his life, in case you can't get your hands on Merchant of Death, because that's not an easy book to come across. For all intents and purposes, he's really the father of the military-industrial complex. He sort of popularized the idea of an international arms trade, and apparently the first Bond villain was actually inspired by him because he was such a sort of mysterious, behind-the-scenes evildoer, only in real life. So Basil Zaharoff was a Greek businessman turned merchant of death at a time when arms manufacturing really wasn't so industrialized. But as the Industrial Revolution evolved, as armaments became easier to mass produce, he was the first salesman to really kind of take off selling these armaments. He was one of the first people to sell submarines as well as airplanes. And he also started the concept of an arms race where essentially you would arm one country, go to another country and say, hey, they're building up munitions, they're building up their armaments, you better build up your military so that when they invade you, you have something to fight back with. And then of course other nations see that other people are building up their army, so then they have to build up their army, and of course someone has to sell them those weapons. So he was just panicking all of these nations to keep the sales flowing using the newspapers, which was actually pretty common at the time. A lot of people owned newspapers because the press wasn't so consolidated like it is now. Of course you have the internet, you know, people like me, I guess, but you didn't have like huge media conglomerates. You had just a lot of wealthy people that would just have like a daily newspaper in various cities so that they could spread their influence and in some cases propaganda. Now, one of the key themes of Merchants of Death is highlighted in the example of the Brie foundry. Not sure if I'm saying that right, I will spell it down here, but essentially it was a metal ore foundry that was French, but then it was overtaken by the Germans. This was like where they were getting the bulk of their material for their war machine, and the French at any point could have bombed this with airplanes, or at one point it was even within artillery range, but they chose not to, basically at the direction of Basil Zakharov, who essentially convinced the French government that destroying the foundry was not in the best interest of the people, because then you would have people without a job, you would have unemployment during wartime, and also you can use that foundry post-war for other non-war activities. However, again, this was how the German war machine was getting a lot of their ore, so destroying that particular facility would hinder their war effort and possibly stop the war sooner, but there's not a whole lot of profits to be made in peacetime. So he actually convinced them to spare this factory, and then it prolonged the war, and it gave him more profits from all of these weapon dealings. And the book really covers so many other topics like that, like how the DuPonts, the family started a company in America and then eventually grew so powerful that they, quote, owned the state of Delaware, including several daily newspapers, of course. Or how JP Morgan sold 5,000 rifles that he knew were defective, and so he sold them at a profit, but they just ended up blowing off people's hands. And just like today, the book goes on to state that the war machine is bought and maintained by the taxpayer because their elected representatives keep allocating money to it, and this will only continue as long as nationalism, militarism, and war continues. And there's also just a shit ton of statistics, like how 66 million people were mobilized to fight in World War I, 37 million casualties, $208 billion were spent in the early 1910s, and it verifies the 21,000 new millionaires that Smedley Butler mentioned in his book. And of course the DuPonts, the JP Morgans, they had their stocks quadruple. And there was even one section that I thought was rather interesting about how Wall Street started panicking that the Allies were going to lose. This is before America formally joined the war, though they were still, of course, extending loans. I think JP Morgan gave like 500 billion in loans to the Allies, as well as, of course, armaments and all of that. But once it became clear that they might actually lose, of course, all those loans would just be defaulted because they wouldn't have a way to repay those loans, so then it might just cause economic collapse here in America, which was one of the reasons why America joined the war, was to ensure that those loans were paid back. But also, of course, it got to use up more munitions, more bullets, more bombs, more everything that, of course, was sold by the merchants of death, those in the arms-making industries, who were just making an absolute killing. No pun intended. The book goes on to describe another interesting statistic about the evolution of warfare, saying that the average regiment in 1914 consisted of about 3,300 men, 6 machine guns, and that was it. However, by 1932, that same regiment consisted of 2,500 men, 108 submachine guns, 16 machine guns, 4 bomb throwers, and 2 small cannons, equaling to about a 210% increase in automatic arms. And again, with this being published in 1934, it talks about the rise of Hitler and German rearmament, and basically how they found subsidiary or friendly factories in Holland, Switzerland, Sweden, Italy, Turkey, which all gave a worthy cause for the arms makers of those countries to, again, make a profit off of German rearmament, because there is money to be had, and because the Treaty of Versailles didn't stipulate that German arms manufacturers couldn't make weapons outside of Germany. I also thought it was interesting that they talked about I.G. Farben, who of course became Bayer after World War II, but I.G. Farben was also the maker of Zyklon B, which is what the Nazis used in the German concentration camps, and how they were using cellulose provided by the British to make explosives. It also talks about Japan and how they were an isolated nation, of course, until Commodore Perry came up with that gunboat diplomacy and opened up Japan to the wider world, but Japan was sold Western arms once they realized how powerful they were, and of course they used those arms pretty effectively against the Russians and the Chinese. And apparently on February 27th, 1933, there was a comment about a British arms maker that was making both weapons for the Japanese and the Chinese, and actually had representatives of both nations come to their facility. And so they had to give probably like an awkward tour of like, yeah, and so here we make your grenades grenades, and over there we make grenades for, yeah, don't worry about that. Also, it was estimated that 12 to 13 billion dollars were spent on equipping the 5 million American soldiers that fought in the First World War, which was roughly equal to about half of all the money appropriated by Congress from the First Continental Congress down to our declaration of war against Germany, to put into perspective how much money we actually spent on that war. And I'm just going to read a section from the last few pages of the book where it says that our civilization has permitted and even fostered war-making forces such as nationalism, chauvinism, economic rivalry and competitive capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, political and territorial disputes, race hatred, and pressure of population. The traditional way of establishing an equilibrium between these forces has been and is violence, armed warfare. Disarmament is thus the problem of our civilization. And the only way for that to happen is to change civilization so that the precursors of war are abolished, and therefore there's no need for the arms makers. Now, of course, both of these books are just absolutely fascinating in their own right, but especially now in the modern context when we're looking at China, we're looking at Russia, we're looking at possibly World War III. We now have drone warfare, and of course the military-industrial complex is just as prominent as ever, both in America, but now even in Russia, because if Russia stops the war in Ukraine, essentially their economy will just collapse because it's the only thing keeping their economy going. Because when your economy is so entrenched in making armaments, you have so many people who rely on those jobs that you can't stop the war effort, because then you will lose all of those jobs, and that in of itself will bring economic collapse. So just like these books and how everything they talk about will only be exacerbated because of World War II, now it seems like the merchants of death are still making money hand over fist, and we've seen it with Iraq and Afghanistan, where the public can still be convinced to go to war and spend trillions of dollars on that war effort, spend thousands of lives fighting those wars, and again, people are still making huge amounts of money. Raytheon, Halliburton. Now we got AI coming into the mix. Now, what I was getting at when it comes to Battlefield 1 was that after reading these books, which I read these books like just a few months after that game released, I literally couldn't play it anymore because I was so disgusted by what I was seeing, because you're shooting these rifles, you're shooting these cannons, you're putting on this gas mask to survive the gas attacks, and you do the moral math and you're thinking of all the people that lost their lives and all the people that made so much fucking money prolonging that war, even supplying both sides of the war, from the bankers to the politicians to the arms industry to the press. And so I really didn't play that game for like 6 months, 8 months, I really don't know, but it was a significant amount of time. But since then, my thoughts have changed on this topic, where I think people need that outlet. I think video games or even heavy music can be a worthy outlet for the anger, frustration. Maybe you just need a distraction from your day-to-day life. And video games, music, movies, they can provide that for you because everyone needs an outlet. And honestly, I will gladly take violent video games and heavy music over war any day. So here at the end, I have a few recommendations for you guys if you stayed this long. Again, thank you for staying this long. But again, Behind the Bastards, if you want more on Basil Zaharoff or even the business plot. But there is a great movie that I cannot recommend enough called All Quiet on the Western Front. The remake of that, if you want a really good cinematic experience, a major motion picture, you might say, about the cost of war, what it was actually like in those trenches. Again, I highly recommend War Is A Racket. It's a super quick read if you want a book, but if you want a song, then I have the perfect recommendation for you. Again, coming at us from the hip-hop artist Low Key with his song Keep Your Hand on Your Gun, which is a direct call out of those arms manufacturers, of those merchants of death, and it's a fantastic song. So again, guys, thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you like the vibe. Let me know what you thought about these books, about this topic, about Battlefield in general. Again, I'm glad that they have a actual solid entry with a good launch. Again, check out the Patreon, and if you guys want some more protest music, definitely check out those other reviews that we have on the channel. And again, guys, just thank you so much. So stay well, stay safe, stay informed, and we will see you on the next one. Later.